Welcome, everyone, to today's session of Managing Your Finances During Cancer Estate Planning Pitfalls, led by Rick Fingerman. This program is hosted by the Blum Resource Center. Over at the Blum, we are grateful to Rick for this continued partnership. The recording of this session will be posted on our Blum YouTube playlist and our Blum Digital Resource Center. For those of you watching live, if you have any questions related to today's program, please feel free to utilize the chat feature throughout the session. At the end of the session, your questions in the chat will be used to moderate the question and answer. If you have any other questions or would like more information about resources and programs offered through the Blum, please visit our website at www.dana-farber.org/resource center or email us at blum_center@dfci.harvard.edu. Thank you all for joining us. I will now pass the workshop over to Rick.
Thank you, Sierra. So welcome everyone to another in a series of webinars on how to manage finances during cancer treatment. This actually applies to everyone. And today's topic is estate planning pitfalls. When we hear the word estate planning, we might think, the wealthy people need to do estate planning, but actually everybody should be doing some form of estate planning, which we'll see as we walk through this. And today we're going to just look at three different scenarios. These are actual people that I've come across over the years. The names, of course, have been changed to protect the innocent, but we'll walk through that. And if you have any questions, you can, type those into the window. On the last slide is my contact info. So anyone that's a patient of Dana-Farber that wants to chat with me at no cost, that's great. You can just email me and we'll see more about that as we go through the slides. So a little bit about the Pro Bono Financial Coaching Program. This was developed back in 2008. A trustee of Dana-Farber had a brilliant idea. And the idea was, hey, there's a lot of patients of Dana-Farber that are struggling financially because they might be out of work. Maybe one of their caregivers, their spouse is out of work or taking care of them. And they've got some financial issues and complexities that a cancer diagnosis, just really makes much worse. So we developed this program. We've helped well over 600 families to date. That's a younger version of me holding up little trophy in the middle. And any awards that we have won, this was an award for $5,000 from the Foundation for Financial Planning, go to the Patient Assistance Fund. So again, we're always looking for opportunities to get some type of grant and donate that to the fund. Just a little disclaimer, this is purely for informational purposes. It's not meant to be legal or financial or medical or any other type of advice. But as I said before, if you have a question specific to yourself, your own situation, feel free. On the last slide is my contact info to reach out to me, and I'm happy to help. Oh, and I'll add one more thing before we get to Sarah and Michael. If you're a part of the Pro Bono Financial Coaching Program, that does include estate planning. We help patients with all types of things. We have attorneys that will actually draft an estate plan for you and potentially at no cost. So if this is something that you feel you need, or you've got a plan, but it's really old or things have changed, definitely reach out to me and we can connect you with one of those estate planning attorneys to see if we can get that done for you. So Sarah and Michael is a married couple, first marriage for both. They've got two minor kids, Emma and Ava. Again, these names have been changed, so if you know anybody in this situation, it's just purely coincidence. And here's the situation. Last fall, Michael died suddenly from a car accident at the age of 42. Pretty tragic. So the facts are that neither Sarah nor Michael had any estate planning documents completed, such as a will or a trust. They just didn't get around to it like most people. They're raising their kids, they're busy, they're working, and we just don't do things we should do. So here's some other facts. Michael did have a life insurance policy through work, which was great. However, the death benefit was less than $200,000. So many times people have life insurance through their employer. It's some type of group term policy usually, which means you either get it free, and sometimes it's like 1 times your salary. And if you want to buy additional life insurance, you can, and that comes out of your paycheck. The issue with group term insurance, though, is generally speaking, when you leave your employer, whether you quit, get fired, whatever happens, you lose that coverage. You don't have that life insurance anymore. So I've sat down with clients that have $1 million of insurance through their employer, then they get laid off, they've got 3 small kids at home, and now they don't have any life insurance. So it can be an issue. So it's something you definitely want to think about if your only life insurance, and if it's needed, is through an employer. Michael also had a 401k through his job. However, he neglected to name a beneficiary. And we're going to hear a lot more about beneficiaries and why you really need these listed on different types of accounts. So he didn't name a beneficiary. So here's the issues. He didn't have a will. He didn't have a beneficiary on the 401k plan. He had minimal life insurance, did not have enough. Because think of it this way. People say, well, how much life insurance do I need? And there's all kinds of calculators and ways to figure that out. But let's just say, for an example, Michael made $100,000 a year and the kids are 3 and 4. Well, that's a lot of years that if something happened to Michael, that those paychecks are just gone. So life insurance can replace that income for a number of years, at least until the kids are 18 or through college or something like that, where, Sarah would need some help financially because most likely she's going to have to continue working. She might need help with daycare. There's a cost to that. There's all kinds of costs when someone passes away, especially if you've got young kids. So didn't have enough life insurance, and then probate. So we'll talk more about probate a little later, but basically, because there was not a beneficiary named on the 401k plan, it didn't go directly to Sarah. It just doesn't work that way. There has to be a person named on life insurance or IRAs, 401k plans, 403b plans, in order for that to go directly to the person that you want it to go to. Now, Sarah ultimately did get that money, but it had to go through the probate process first. And just changing the screen over here. And that's just a time delay. If she needs money to do something, well, she has to wait for it. There's no way she's going to get that quickly. Now, the life insurance, she'll get that quickly. She just has to produce a death certificate and some other information, and that check is usually pretty fast to come. But as far as the 401k, because there was no beneficiary named, it goes through that probate process. And that's really just a process to determine ownership after someone dies, to make sure the will is valid, things like that. And there is a cost to it, and probate can take 9 months, could take a year. I'm helping a family right now that's going into 2 years of this whole probate process because it's just such a mess. The estate is such a mess. But anyway, so it can be quick, but it can take, a year or so. But the good news was the house transfers directly to Sarah because they own that jointly. And if you own something jointly, whether it's a bank account, whether it's a home, that house transfers or that property transfers to the other person immediately. There's no probate at all. And as I mentioned, the 401k does transfer to Sarah, but it has to go through that probate process first, and that can take time. So something that could easily be fixed if it's just done. And when we sit down with our clients in my day job, we look at the beneficiaries very carefully, because I had clients that say to me, oh, no, my 401k has my husband down as a beneficiary or my wife down. And then we look at it and there's nothing there. So they might have given that information to the employer or to the provider of the 401k, but they just never entered it or something happened. So we spend a lot of time making sure that all those I's are dotted and the T's are crossed. The next couple is Nora and Carl. They're a married couple. Now, this is a second marriage for both. And generally, when we have a second marriage, especially if there's children from that previous marriage, it really makes things complex. And it just complicates things because there's a lot more things going on. So they had 4 kids. They each had 2. Nora had 2 daughters, Melissa, Emma. Carl had a son and a daughter, Sue and Dawn. And let's see what their issue was. So the situation was that Nora passed away after a long illness at the age of 87. And then 2 years later, Carl passed away at the age of 90. So that in itself seems like pretty good because they had a long life. However, there was some financial issues, and we'll see what that is. So here's the fact. So Nora came into that second marriage with a very large asset. She had a beach house in Truro, Mass, that her family had had for 3 generations. And at the time, this was years ago too, it was worth $2 million. So today we're probably looking at $5 million for this house. So that was that issue. Now, here was the issue. Nora and Carl did not have a formal estate plan. They had conversations based on, I did meet with Nora's daughters. That's how I learned about this situation. This was after the fact. But they did have a, just, an agreement orally, but not a formal estate plan. So when Nora died, the house passed to Carl, her new husband, which was fine at the moment. But when Carl died 2 years later, the house passed to his two children, and it disinherited Nora's two daughters. Because there was no estate plan, there was nothing drafted that Nora did that said, hey, when I pass away, I want to make sure that this house stays in my family. And if my husband Carl dies, I want to make sure it goes to my two daughters and stays in my family. Well, because he didn't do that, and she didn't do that, it actually went to Carl's children. And they could have, if they wanted to, said to the two daughters, you know what, I know this was probably meant to pass to you. We're going to just sign this over to you. But they didn't, and they kept the house. So it caused a lot of issues on so many levels, financially, emotionally, and otherwise. So you want to be really careful, even if you're sitting there watching this and saying, you know what, I don't have a $5 million beach house, down the Cape. That may be true, but there are other things that can really mess up a family if they're not done properly. And some simple estate planning, some beneficiary planning, some trust planning can go a long way, and it's worth every penny. For example, Nora could have drafted a trust before she died that said, hey, Carl gets to live in this house as long as he's alive. When he passes away, he transfers to my two daughters outright. Very simple. They were adults. They would have inherited that house, and all this would have been avoided, but it wasn't. And our last case study is Philippe. He's a widowed single man. They didn't have any children, so it seems kind of easy in a way, right? Because there's not a lot of complexity there. He passed away at 77, and he left an estate worth $2 million, consisting of an IRA and an annuity. Now, both of those types of accounts allow you to name a beneficiary. And as we have already learned, if you name a beneficiary, it goes directly to that person. Now, it had to be a person named as beneficiary. More times than not, I have seen someone name their estate as beneficiary. So it would say the estate of Philippe, for example, instead of his nieces and nephews. What happens there is because it's his estate, that asset, that $2 million goes into his estate, and then it goes through probate. And then when that's all figured out after a year or so, then it gets distributed the way that he wanted usually. Now, his will said that he wanted his estate divided equally among his 5 nieces and nephews. So that, seems pretty simple. But even though that was his intent to leave that to the nieces and nephews, based on the will, the beneficiaries of his IRA and annuity were never updated, and they still named his deceased wife. So when his wife passed away, he did not update those beneficiaries. Could have easily have either listed the 5 kids, he could have created a trust and named the trust as beneficiary, and the trust document would have said, this money goes equally to my 5 nieces and nephews. And in fact, if some of those nieces and nephews were young, let's say they were 12 years old, and he didn't want them to inherit that money outright, the trust could say, I name a trustee to provide income to that minor until they're a certain age, and then they get the assets at that point. So a trust allows you to have a whole lot more control. And there's 2 types of trusts. Generally, there's a revocable trust, which means it's changeable. So you could change your mind at any time. You could revoke the trust, you could change it, you could do whatever you want with it. And then there's irrevocable trusts. Those are harder to change. Basically, they're irrevocable and you can't really change them. So most trusts, it makes sense to do a revocable trust, or they're also known as living trusts, which while you're alive, you can change them again and do whatever you like. So let's talk a little bit about that probate process. Remember I said it's really just a process to make sure that the assets are taken care of the way that they're supposed to. And if something does not have a beneficiary designation attached to it or owned jointly with someone else, it generally goes through that probate process. And there might be some assets that you wouldn't think of, so we're going to go through those as well. So what types of assets go through probate? And this is ownership title. So if something's titled in the decedent's name, the person that passed away only, then it's not owned jointly or payable on death. You might see, and I think I'll talk a little bit about POD and TOD, and that stands for payable on death or transfer on death. The reason that's important is because in an IRA or life insurance, there's a line that says beneficiary. But if you're a single person or even if you're a couple and you open up a bank account, for an example, there's usually not a provision on that application to name a beneficiary. You have to add this extra paper called a TOD, or transfer on death, or POD, payable on death. Different states and different institutions use different ones, but they all do the same thing. And you can name that person so you avoid probate on those types of assets as well. So assets without beneficiary designations is something like a bank account. It just doesn't come with one. You've got to add that TOD or POD to that, and then it does what you want. If you are a married couple, you might think, well, I think, Rick, you just said anything I own individually goes through probate, but if I own it jointly, then it's going to go to that other person, no problem. Just like that house went from, I think, Michael to Sarah because they owned it jointly. If something happened to Michael and Sarah together, though, then that asset could go through probate. So you could add a POD or TOD to those jointly owned assets as well. Real estate's a different story. In Massachusetts, you cannot add a TOD or a POD to a deed. So when you pass away and you're a single person, it goes through probate unless you create a trust and retitle that asset, that house, into the name of the trust. New York State just changed that law recently, so you can actually add a POD, a payable on death, to your deed. So if you live in New York, again, I'm not giving legal advice, but you could either do a trust or you could do that. One has a lot more advantages than the other, but you definitely want to sit down with an estate planning attorney that practices law in the state that you own that property to see what's best for you. So the last one is assets not included in a living trust. So remember I said if you have a living trust or revocable trust, it avoids probate. Well, many times I sit down with clients, they've got a revocable trust, they did their estate plan, it all looks good. And then I actually look at the assets and they've not been retitled into the name of that trust. So that trust really did no good at all. Well, I shouldn't say no good at all. It does apply, but it has to go through probate first, and then it gets put into the trust generally. But it avoids that whole, reason that you did the trust to begin with was probably to avoid probate. So long story short, if you have assets, even if you own a trust, you want to make sure they're retitled into the name of the trust. And just as a side note, it's not in here, but just to let you know, in case you ask this question, if you have an IRA or a 401k or things like that, you don't want to put those in a trust. You really can't do that, but you can name the beneficiary of the trust if you want a little bit more control than leaving it outright to that beneficiary. So in the case of someone that has 3 adult children, they're all doing well, maybe you just name the 3 kids as beneficiaries. But if you have a kid that's special needs, or you have an adult child that has some issues, or maybe they're going through a divorce, as that happens, maybe a trust makes more sense because it gives you a little more control. Okay, so here's some stuff that's subject to probate. As we talked about, bank or investment accounts that do not have that TOD or POD, they go through probate. Stocks and bonds, again, that you own individually, they go through probate. Autos, boats, airplanes, that's a little tricky because it's hard to put a TOD, something like that on there, but some things you can put into a trust. All depends on states and other things. If you have a business, that could go through probate. I had a client years ago that had a long-term care insurance policy. This is a policy that helps pay for their care, either at home if they need help or into like a nursing home facility. Some of these policies, these are older policies that gave like a return of premium, like a rider. So let's say somebody paid, $100,000 into a long-term care policy during their life. They never used it, but it had a cash rider that was like $50,000. Well, that amount would get payable to the estate of the deceased and would have to go through probate. So that's something else to be considered of. Real estate, if you're holding that individually, that's going to go through probate. Assisted living deposit. So let's say you want to move into some assisted living building and they require you to come up with $500,000 as a down payment to get into that. And then they charge you a monthly fee on top of that. Generally, the way those work is when you pass away, they take 90% of whatever you put in and they give that back to your family. You want to make sure that you get those deposits back. But again, that could go through probate. And it implies if you own a Rembrandt or something, that might be something else that might be going through the probate process. So what's not considered a probate asset? Again, I know I'm repeating myself here, but people do get messed up on this. So anything that names a beneficiary, life insurance, 401k plans, 403bs, IRAs, if you name a person as a beneficiary, that will avoid that probate process. Bear in mind that anything that you name as a beneficiary usually supersedes one's wishes in a will. So let's say, for an example, your IRA names your sister as beneficiary, but your will names your brother as beneficiary. Well, your brother is not going to get that IRA asset because you named your sister as an actual beneficiary. So you really want to make sure that when you do your estate plan, you coordinate all these things so nothing gets messed up or misinterpreted. Funds held in a pension plan, those really, don't go through probate. Jointly owned assets, as I said before, if you've got a husband and wife, brother and sister, two friends, they own a bank account or house together. When one passes away, the JTWROS stands for Joint Tenants with Right of Survivorship. It goes to the person that survived. But when that person dies, if nothing's changed, then that asset would go through probate. So again, you got to look at all this stuff. Any kind of fund, securities, savings bonds, if they're registered as TOD or POD. So if you have savings bonds that you bought on Treasury Direct online, you can actually log on there and you can add a beneficiary to those accounts. It's a little funky. That site's not the easiest and friendliest, in my opinion, but you can add a beneficiary through this TOD or POD on the Treasury Direct site. Cars and boats, that's kind of goes by state, so you have to be careful with that. And if you have assets that are in that living trust or revocable trust or even an irrevocable trust and they're retitled, they will not go through probate. So that offers that protection there too. But just to let you know, before we get to this slide, probate, some people tell you it's the worst thing in the world. There is a cost to it. There is time involved. There is, someone needs to do that. Usually it's an estate planning attorney that helps out with that. So they have to, charge for their time. So if you want to avoid probate, it's not a bad thing to do if that's something that you're concerned about. And there are strategies and tools you can use to do that. So here's just some considerations. Don't close out emails, bank accounts, social media accounts, because once you close those, you're in trouble. I've had clients over the years. I work a lot with women that have lost their spouse, and they immediately have closed out a joint account that had their husband on there. And more times than not, a check has come, whether it's from the IRS, whether it's from an insurance company, whether it's from something made out to both of them. And now it's really difficult to deposit that check. So it's okay to leave those bank accounts open for a while. RMD stands for required minimum distribution. If somebody owns IRAs or 401ks and they're over a certain age, so if you're born in 1960, they just changed the rule, then your required minimum distribution age isn't until 75. If you were born before that, it could be 72 or 73. So if you are at that age group and you didn't take your required distribution and then you passed away, you've got to make sure that the beneficiary of the whoever's settling the estate takes that required distribution. This is one that's come up through the program at Dana-Farber. If you have credit cards in your name alone and you pass away and you don't have any money in your estate, you might not be required to pay that credit card off. So it's something to think about before we start paying things off. I've helped many patients settle estates after their spouse died. And some of them, we were able to just get that debt wiped away and didn't have to pay it off. Federal student loans is another area that people don't always know about. This doesn't apply to private loans. If you went down to the bank and got a student loan, you've got to pay that off when someone dies. But federal student loans, under current law, if someone passes away, they're forgiven. And I've had a good handful of patients that I've helped do that. You don't always get something in writing because the federal student loan department doesn't work that smoothly, but they are forgiven. If you're in assisted living, if you've paid for expenses and all that stuff, I've had a couple of clients, we've got a refund. We've gone there to get that money back. That assisted living down payment, we want to get that back because that could be a lot of money. And I've had a couple of people that have had prepaid funeral homes, funeral plans, where you actually pay for your funeral ahead of time, years before you might pass away. And the reason people do that is it kind of locks in the price, number one, but more importantly, it makes it easier for those left behind. They don't have to go down to the funeral home and start picking out things and making decisions that would be really difficult at that point, after losing someone. But if you already have one, you want to make sure that you look into that, or that's known to the beneficiaries or whoever's left, because you don't want to pay for a funeral twice. I think that might be it. Let's see. Oh, and then I've got some resources here. So this is 5 Wishes. This is agingwithdignity.com. This is a good free thing that it's just good to have. It makes you kind of think about decisions and things you might want, kind of what kind of medical treatment you might want, things like that. So again, this is in the slides. You can find this if you do the replay. There's also some other programs. There's Social Security, Social Security Disability, survivor benefits. For those that don't have a lot of income, they didn't really work much, there's a program called SSI, which is a supplemental Social Security, the last one. You could get a benefit there. And then there's other government programs like Medicare and Veterans Benefits, Treasury Direct. That's where you would actually go. You could search to see if somebody has savings bonds, for example, that you might not even know about. And then Find Money. This is something I've helped some clients do. We've logged in there, you put the person's name in. You can try it with yourself. There's one called massmoney.com, and that's for Massachusetts specifically. I think this link might bring you to all states. But you put your name in there and answer some questions, and it'll tell you if there's any money that's around. I've got a couple of bucks here and there. I've tried to get it back, and then I got busy and just didn't bother. But and then here's my offer to you anyway, a complimentary call if you want to talk about your personal situation. If you're a patient or a family member of Dana-Farber, and it looks like the pro bono coaching program is a good fit, I can steer you into that program and you can get help there as well. Email is best for me because I'm generally in meetings all day and don't really answer the phone too much. So email me, let me know what's going on, and we can set up a time to talk.
Thank you so much, Rick, for that informative and important presentation with many helpful resources.
Yeah, estate planning in 30 minutes.
Yes. We have one question that came in. A person wrote, "This is all great information. If I don't have any of these plans in place, where would be the best place to start?" So do you have any, place that you'd be like, you should prioritize looking here, or maybe it even is a call with you? What do you think would be the best way to
I
go
think,
about
a
that?
call with me would be a good idea. So I think when you say nothing in place, you don't have estate planning documents like a will.
Yes.
It's good to determine what you actually need. So
Mhm.
some people need a trust and some people absolutely do not need a trust. There are certain basic documents like a healthcare proxy that gives someone the right to make medical decisions for you if you're unable to do that. I think that's a really important document to have. There's also something called a living will, which is more of an end of life, like life support type wishes. And in that 5 wishes thing, I think that's not a bad pamphlet to get. Again, it's free. And that might get you thinking about things that you need to think about or where you might need to get some help. But things like trust and stuff, that's when you've got more complex issues. You own multiple pieces of property, or you've got kids with different needs, things like that. So again, if somebody does not have an estate plan and they are a patient of Dana-Farber, we can get them one.
Awesome.
Yep.
Thank you so much, Rick. And as I mentioned earlier, this session was recorded and it will be posted on our Blum YouTube playlist in our Blum Digital Resource Center. I think we are all set, so thank you so much, Rick.
Okay, thank you.